The early morning mist hung low over the pine forests of northern Montana as Sarah Reeves made her way along the hiking trail. At 42, she had the weathered face of someone who had spent most of her life outdoors, a wildlife photographer. By profession and passion, Sarah had moved to this remote cabin 3 years ago after her divorce, seeking solace in the wilderness she had always loved. The autumn air was crisp, and golden leaves crunched beneath her boots as she followed a deer path she'd been tracking for her latest photography project. The sound of rushing water from a nearby stream provided a soothing backdrop to the otherwise silent forest. Sarah paused, crouching down to examine some unusual tracks in the soft earth. "Not deer," she muttered to herself, camera hanging ready. Around her neck, too small, and the pattern is different. A faint mewling sound caught her attention. Sarah froze, her senses suddenly alert. It came again, a weak, pained cry that seemed to emanate from a dense thicket just off the trail. Cautiously she approached, pushing aside branches to reveal a shocking sight. A female bobcat lay on its side, clearly injured, with blood matting the fur along its flank. Sarah could see the animal had been caught in a trap, illegal in this protected area, and had managed to break free, but not without sustaining serious injuries. Beside the bobcat, 2 tiny cubs, no more than a few weeks old, huddled against their mother's body, mewling pitifully. Sarah's heart sank. The mother bobcat's breathing was labored, and her eyes were glazed with pain. As a wildlife photographer, Sarah knew the protocols. Call the rangers, keep her distance, let nature take its course. But something about the scene before her made those rules suddenly seem hollow. "I can't just leave you here," she whispered, her breath visible in the cold morning air. The mother bobcat's eyes fluttered closed, and Sarah made a decision. Taking off her jacket, she approached slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. The injured animal was too weak to fight, as Sarah carefully wrapped her jacket around it. The cubs hissed weakly as she gathered them into her backpack, creating a makeshift nest with her scarf. "I know this isn't by the book," she said to the frightened animals, "but I can't let you die out here, not like this." The 30-minute hike back to her cabin became an exercise in gentle movement. Sarah carried the mother bobcat as steadily as possible, wincing each time the animal let out a pained sound. The cubs had fallen silent in her backpack, which worried her even more. By the time she reached her cabin, a rustic solar-powered structure nestled among towering pines, Sarah's arms were burning with fatigue. She placed the injured bobcat on a blanket near the wood stove and carefully removed the cubs from her backpack, placing them next to their mother. With shaking hands, she dialed the number of the only veterinarian within 50 miles, Dr. James Cooper. "James, it's Sarah Reeves," she said when he answered. "I've got an emergency. A female bobcat badly injured with 2 cubs. She's been caught in a trap." The silence on the other end spoke volumes. "Sarah, you know I can't." "She'll die, James, and then the cubs will die too. I'm not asking you to break the law. I'm asking you to help me save them until the Wildlife Rehab Center can take over." Another pause, followed by a sigh. "I'll be there in 40 minutes. But Sarah, this has to be temporary. You understand that, right?" "I know," she replied, looking at the small family huddled on her floor. "I know." Dr. James Cooper had been the veterinarian in Pinewood County for nearly 20 years. At 55, his salt and pepper beard and calm demeanor had earned him the trust of the small community. He specialized in large animals, the cattle, horses, and sheep that populated the local ranches. But he treated everything from barn cats to family dogs. What he did not treat, as a rule, were wild animals. His truck bounced along the unpaved road leading to Sarah's remote cabin, his medical bag packed with supplies that would technically be illegal to use on wildlife without proper authorization. James knew Sarah from her frequent visits to town and her wildlife conservation advocacy work. She wasn't someone who would call without good reason. When he pulled up to the cabin, Sarah was waiting on the porch, her expression tense. "Thank you for coming," she said, leading him inside. "She's by the fire." James knelt beside the injured bobcat, his experienced eyes quickly assessing the damage. The animal was unconscious now, its breathing shallow. Trap wound, like you said. She's lost a lot of blood. He glanced at the two cubs huddled against their mother. And these little ones are dehydrated. Sarah hovered anxiously as James set to work, cleaning the wound, administering antibiotics, and placing an IV drip to rehydrate the animal. "You know I should report this," he said quietly as he worked. "Wildlife rehabilitation is regulated for a reason." "I do know," Sarah admitted. "But look at her, James. She was caught in an illegal trap. Someone broke the law first." James didn't respond, focusing instead on suturing the deep gash in the bobcat's side. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and sighed. "She might make it, she might not. The next 24 hours will tell." He then examined the cubs, who were surprisingly compliant in his hands, a sign of their weakened state. "They need to be fed every few hours, special formula." He reached into his bag and pulled out some supplies. "This is all I can do for now. I'll come back tomorrow to check on them. But Sarah, you need to contact the wildlife authorities." Sarah nodded, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "What would happen to them?" "If I called right now," James hesitated. "The mother, if she survives, would be rehabilitated and released. The cubs," he trailed off, "would likely be raised in captivity or euthanized if no facility has space." Sarah finished for him. "I've worked with enough wildlife agencies to know how this goes. It's still the law," James reminded her gently. Sarah walked him to the door as he prepared to leave. "Just give me a few days until she's stable, then I'll make the call." James looked at her for a long moment. 3 days, Sarah. That's all I can give you." After he left, Sarah returned to the bobcats. The mother was still unconscious, but her breathing seemed stronger. The cubs had curled up against her side, tiny spotted bodies rising and falling with each breath. 3 days. Sarah whispered. "Then we'll figure something out." The first night was the hardest. Every hour, Sarah checked on the mother bobcat, monitoring her breathing and temperature. The cubs needed to be fed with the special formula Dr. Cooper had provided, a delicate process that involved using a small syringe to carefully feed each cub while avoiding getting fluid in their lungs. By morning, Sarah was exhausted, but relieved to see the mother bobcat had made it through the night. The animal's eyes were open, alert but wary, watching Sarah's every move from across the room. "You're looking better," Sarah said softly, keeping her distance. She knew better than to approach an injured wild predator, no matter how small. Over the next 2 days, a routine developed. Sarah would feed the cubs while the mother watched, too weak to protest but clearly aware of everything happening around her. Sarah named the mother Luna, for the crescent-shaped marking on her forehead, and the cubs Pip and Scout. By the 3rd day, Luna was strong enough to eat the raw meat Sarah had acquired from the local butcher. The wound was healing well, and the cubs were more active, playfully tumbling over each other in the small enclosed space Sarah had created for them. Dr. Cooper returned as promised, surprised by the progress. "I've never seen a wild bobcat recover this quickly," he remarked, carefully examining Luna's wound. The bobcat tolerated his touch with surprising calmness, only the occasional twitch of her ear indicating her discomfort. "She seems to understand." "We're helping her," Sarah said, watching as Luna's eyes followed her movements around the cabin. James gave her a skeptical look. "Don't anthropomorphize, Sarah. She's tolerating us because she's protecting her cubs and she's still weak. But she's getting stronger every day." "I know what she is," Sarah replied defensively. "I've photographed bobcats for years. I understand their behavior. This is different." James finished changing Luna's bandage and stood up. "The time's up." "Sarah, you need to call the wildlife authorities tomorrow." Sarah nodded, but as she watched Luna gently grooming her cubs that evening, her resolve wavered. The thought of the small family being separated, the cubs potentially raised in captivity, weighed heavily on her mind. That night, Sarah fell asleep on the couch near the bobcat's enclosure, a book about wildlife rehabilitation open on her chest. She woke with a start hours later, the fire reduced to embers, casting the cabin in shadows. Something had disturbed her sleep, a sound or a movement. Sarah sat up slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The door to the bobcat's enclosure was open. Panic surged through her Had Luna escaped with her cubs? Sarah's eyes darted around the cabin, finally settling on a shape at the foot of the couch. Luna sat there, watching her, the two cubs asleep beside her. The bobcat hadn't attempted to escape. Instead, she had moved her family closer to Sarah. "Hey there," Sarah whispered, hardly daring to breathe. "What are you doing out?" Luna blinked slowly, then did something that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. The bobcat stood, approached the couch, and gently placed a paw on Sarah's knee, meeting her eyes with an intelligence that seemed to transcend the barrier between human and wild animal. In that moment, Sarah understood that whatever happened next, her life had changed irrevocably. Dr. James Cooper arrived at Sarah's cabin the following morning for what was supposed to be his final checkup before the wildlife authorities were called. He knocked on the door, medical bag in hand, mentally preparing for what might be a difficult conversation with Sarah. When she opened the door, James immediately sensed something was different. Sarah's face held a determined expression he recognized from her conservation campaigns. "Before you come in," she said, blocking the doorway, "I need to show you something, and I need you to keep an open mind." James sighed. "Sarah, we had an agreement." "Just watch," she interrupted, stepping aside to let him enter. The sight that greeted him inside the cabin made James freeze in place. Luna, the bobcat, was lying on a blanket near the wood stove. The cubs were playing nearby, but what shocked James was Luna's behavior. The bobcat was completely at ease, watching Sarah as she moved around the cabin, showing none of the fear or aggression wild bobcats typically display around humans. As Sarah approached, Luna stood and rubbed against her leg, not unlike a domestic cat. "What am I looking at, Sarah?" James asked, his voice low with disbelief. "A miracle, maybe," she replied, "or just an extraordinary animal. Watch this." Sarah sat on the floor, and Luna approached her, rubbing her head against Sarah's outstretched hand. Then, to James's astonishment, the bobcat began licking Sarah's face with gentle strokes of her rough tongue. "This is why I couldn't make the call," Sarah explained quietly, stroking Luna's spotted fur. "She's bonded with me, James. I've never seen anything like it." James remained frozen by the door, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hand. "This is unprecedented," he finally managed. "But Sarah, she's still a wild animal. The cubs, too." "I know," Sarah acknowledged. "But what if there's another way? What if I could get certified as a wildlife rehabilitator? Turn part of my property into a proper facility?" James approached cautiously, kneeling to examine Luna, who watched him warily but didn't retreat. The wound was healing well, the sutures ready to be removed. "It's not that simple," he said. "There are regulations, inspections, permits." "I've been researching it," Sarah countered. "There's no rehab facility in this county. The nearest one is overloaded. I have the space, the time, and apparently," she gestured to Luna, "some kind of connection with these animals." As if to emphasize her point, one of the cubs, Pip, tumbled over to James and batted playfully at his shoelace. "You're serious about this?" James asked, watching the cub with amazement. Sarah nodded. "I've already called the state wildlife department. I've been honest about finding Luna and the cubs, but I've also applied for emergency foster care status while I complete the rehabilitation certification. They're sending someone out next week to assess the situation." James was silent for a long moment, weighing his professional responsibilities against what he was witnessing. "I'll support your application," he finally said. "As the local veterinarian, my recommendation carries some weight. But Sarah, you have to understand, even if you get certified, the goal is still rehabilitation and release. Luna and her cubs aren't pets." "I would never treat them as pets," Sarah assured him. "But I think Luna has chosen to trust me for a reason. Maybe this is where I'm meant to make a difference." 3 months later, Sarah's property had been transformed. With James's support and her own determination, she had received preliminary approval for her wildlife rehabilitation license. A proper enclosure had been built for Luna and her growing cubs, designed to gradually reduce human contact and prepare them for eventual release. Luna's case had become something of a phenomenon in wildlife rehabilitation circles. Researchers visited to document the unusual bond between the bobcat and her human rescuer, studying the implications for rehabilitation techniques. On a crisp winter morning, Sarah stood with James by the enclosure, watching Luna teaching her cubs to stalk and pounce, natural behaviors they would need in the wild. "The state wildlife officer thinks they'll be ready for release by spring," Sarah said, a mixture of pride and sadness in her voice. James nodded. "You've done an incredible job, Sarah. Not just with them, but with all of this." He gestured to the half-built structures that would soon house other injured wildlife. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied. "Taking that risk, helping me when it wasn't exactly by the book." James smiled. "Sometimes the right thing isn't in any manual." As they watched, Luna paused in her teaching, turning to look directly at Sarah. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. Wild animal and human, connected by circumstance and compassion. "She won't forget you," James said softly. "And when new animals come through here, they'll benefit from what you learned together." Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I always thought I was meant to observe wildlife, to document it through my camera. I never imagined I'd be part of their story this way." Luna turned back to her cubs, continuing their lesson in survival. Sarah watched, knowing that her own path had been forever altered by the moment she'd found an injured bobcat in the forest and chosen compassion over protocol. In the distance, the Montana mountains stood against the clear blue sky, a reminder of the wilderness that awaited Luna and her cubs, a wilderness that Sarah now understood from a perspective few humans ever would. This story portrays a rare and exceptional circumstance for the purpose of narrative drama. In reality, wild bobcats and other predators should never be approached or handled by untrained individuals. Wildlife rehabilitation requires proper training, facilities, and permits. If you encounter injured wildlife, contact your local wildlife authorities or rehabilitation centers immediately.